My name is Dani Kiani and I'm from the Hat Collective, powered by Hats. A little about us is the Hat Collective has made its mission to educate the next generation of advertising creative professionals by creating a collaborative learning opportunity by students for students. You can find out more information on our website at hatcollective.co.uk or across our social media platforms. The Hat Collective is made possible by the brilliant support from the History of Advertising Trust, who without this initiative, we wouldn't exist. So we want to say a massive thank you to Hats. Make sure to also check the treasure trove that is the History of Advertising Trust online and in person. Now onto our event. Thank you for coming all this evening. We will be exploring diversity and inclusion in advertising today. And our guest speaker is Carl Jones. Oops, sorry, smacking my laptop. Carl Jones is a multi-award winning creative professional and currently a senior lecturer at the University of Westminster. He is an expert in all topics surrounding decolonizing advertising. Tonight, you will hear from Carl about diversity and inclusive representation and why it matters so much in advertising. We will open the floor for questions at the end of the talk so that you can ask your burning questions. If you have any during the talk, please feel free to essentially write them down in the chat box. Alternatively, you can also privately message me with your questions if you'd like to stay anonymous, and I will post them to Carl. So without further ado, I will just share Carl's presentation. Bear with me all just one moment. Here we are. And we'll pop play on. There we go. And without further ado, over to Carl.
Great. Thank you very much, Dani, and welcome to the Hat Collective. Next slide. And today's theme and the question we're going to explore and ask is advertising racist and the importance of diversity and inclusion in the advertising industry. Next slide. So the agenda, what I'm going to touch on today, first of all, we're going to be exploring why does diversity and inclusion matter? Then we'll explore why or does advertising influence or reflect society? Then we'll look at some specific diversity and inclusion matters, such as race, gender, and ageism. Then we'll look at stereotypes, and then we'll explore some solutions. I'm aiming to speak for around 20-25 minutes, and then we'll have questions and answers after, and definitely we'll be finished by 5 p.m. Next slide, please.
6, but I'll move on to the next slide.
Oh, yeah, 6. Sorry about that. Yes.
All right.
So why does diversity and inclusion matter? Next slide. Well, if you look in the dictionary, you will see that it defines diversity as the practice or quality of including or involving people from a range of different social and ethnic backgrounds and of different genders, sexual orientations, etc. Next slide. And then if you look at the word inclusion, it's the practice or policy of providing equal access to opportunities and resources to people who might otherwise be excluded or marginalized, such as those who have physical or mental disabilities and members of other minority groups. Next slide. And why does diversity matter? Well, we're in the culture industries, or we want to get in the culture industries, and diversity and inclusion and advertising impact our understanding of our social surroundings, and also they reproduce roles of social engagement. So we learn how to interact with society through the culture industries. And also it matters because inequality exists. Next slide. And in 2012, there was a survey done, and it found out that the proportion of the creative industries that are BAME is between 4 and 6%, which is extremely low. Next slide. And the McKinsey report showed that companies in the top quartile for ethnic diversity are 33% more likely to have financial returns above national medians. And a government report from the UK showed that the economy benefits in Britain can benefit £24 billion a year if those from ethnically diverse backgrounds progress at the same rate as their white counterparts. Next slide. And I don't know whether you guys know the show Grey's Anatomy, but I thought that I would include Shonda Rhimes. And what she says is that the word diversity suggests something other, as if it is something special, as if there is something unusual about telling stories involving women and people of color and gay characters. I have a different word, and she uses the word normalizing, which I think is terrific. And as you notice, when I do my presentations, I have at the bottom usually links or where I get my information from. So this information that I'm showing you here was from a presentation that by Creative Access. Okay, next slide, please. So what are the issues regarding diversity and inclusion in advertising? Next slide. So we have race, we have ageism, we have misogyny, we have stereotypes, we have gender. There are issues with jobs because of bias in hiring, which we'll explore in a few minutes. And if you guys know of any other diversity and inclusion issues, just drop them into the chat and then we can refer to them later. Next slide. So does advertising influence or reflect society? So let's explore this question first before we can explore other issues. We need to see, does advertising influence? Next slide. David Ogilvy, one of the most famous British advertising madmen, he said that advertising reflects the mores of society, but it does not influence them. So what David is saying is that advertising does not influence society. And then if you see this ad here, which is, I'm sure a lot of you have seen and studied in your universities while looking at advertising, this ad created a big controversy here in the UK. Next slide. And what's interesting is that, you know, I think that advertising reflects what people are thinking and what the typical trends are. So if you look at the painting next to it, which is by Rubens, and you'll see the body shape of the women there, and they're full-bodied, round women, very different than the typical body shape that we see in advertising here. Next slide. So what you can conclude is that advertising does reflect society, because if you look at the advertising process, what we do in advertising is that we pick a target market, we analyze it, we try to understand it, and then we reflect it back to them. You have an image there of a woman in a pink dress looking at herself in the mirror, and the image in the mirror looks larger and heavier than what she actually is. And often it's been said that advertising actually is a critique of what we don't like. So when people criticize advertising, they're actually criticizing society. Next slide. So I'm going to look at now examples of how society is criticizing itself. Next slide. And here you will see pinkification or gender stereotypes. So I'm just going to read you something. And this is a time with a global focus on getting more girls and women interested in the fields of science, technology, math, and engineering. But the clothing and toy aisles are still filled with sexist crap. So moms hope that moves like those by Lego and Land's End are the beginning of a much needed change, because there truly is a particular hell to navigating playthings for girls. Take the never-ending stream of toys pushing domesticity. There's nothing wrong in theory with something like Play Kitchen, but commercials make it clear they're selling gender roles as much as they're selling toys. So basically, as we're growing up, we are told how to act, and advertising plays a big part of that. Next slide. There's also in other countries around the world, in Mexico, for example, questions about diversity arise when white people represent 10% of the Mexican population, but they're in 70% of the advertising messaging. Next slide. And of course, we've discovered algorithms and how the algorithms in Facebook and Instagram possibly could be racist, and algorithms are suppressing Black voices. Algorithms are causing Black people and people of color to be harassed and shadow banned, and also their content to be taken down. Next slide. So now let's look at why does the culture industry use stereotypes to represent race and gender. Next slide. So let's define what is a stereotype. Well, a stereotype is an assumption or belief about an entire group of people. And here we have some examples of different stereotypes from popular culture. Next slide. And if we look back at advertising over 100 years ago, you will see that advertising relies a lot on stereotypes. And stereotypes were used a lot in terms of soap, where skin color, if you had darker skin, then what they said in advertising was that you were dirtier and you needed soap to make you clean. And that reinforced what people were thinking then. Next slide. If you traveled over from Britain to America, you will see here Uncle Sam kicking a person from China out of America. And that is an ad for a washing machine. And in America, the stereotype of people from China was that they were cleaning, they were good at cleaning clothes. And so we have an ad that says, well, we don't need people from China anymore. We can now use our mechanical washers. Next slide. Then in the 1960s, women were stereotyped by being in the kitchen. The chef does everything but cook. That's what wives are for, said this ad by Kenwood. Next slide. Here we have Dolce & Gabbana, which is a fashion brand. And in Italy, they created social media content intended for the Chinese market. What I'm going to show you is from their Instagram ad, and then it caused an uproar. So take a look at this, please. So there we have the model dressed in Dolce & Gabbana clothing, not understanding how to eat Western food. Next slide, please. There should be audio in that, but anyway. So the question I have for you guys is, should advertising ban the use of stereotypes? And what I'd like you to do is just write your answers in the chat, and I'll continue on with my lecture, and then we can review your answers to that question later on. Next slide. So now let's look at misogyny in advertising. We'll look at the two sections. We'll look at in advertising with the messages, and then we'll look at misogyny within advertising agencies. Next slide. Next slide. So we have this very famous Volkswagen ad, classic in advertising museums around the world. Volkswagen, very first campaign that brought together art directors and copywriters. However, some of those amazing ads reflected stereotypes. And here in the 1950s and 60s was the stereotype about the fact that women could not drive cars and they caused accidents. So we have the headline here, sooner or later, your wife will drive home. One of the best reasons of owning a Volkswagen, reinforcing this stereotype. Next slide. This is for socks for men, is my understanding. And the headline says, it's nice to have a girl around the house, with this very offensive image of a man standing on a woman's head, and she is an accessory. Next slide. And a recent ad from India. And here it is from the brand Ford, with the president, or who was the president of Italy, sitting in the front of the car with women tied up in the back to show how spacious the car is. Next slide. And a very recent ad that was written up on an article about sexism in Australian advertising. This ad comes from Britain. And here we have women treated again as an accessory. Next slide. Now let's look at misogyny within advertising agencies. Next slide. Now in 2011, it was analyzed and discovered that only 3% of creative directors were women. And so a group was started in North America, is my understanding, called the 3% Conference. And that conference was designed to get women who work in advertising together to help sort of promote women working as creative directors, and of course in other roles within the advertising industry. Next slide. And in 2018, that number had moved from 3% to 12%. However, that number is still very far off from a 50% is what they were aiming for. So it is improving, but it can improve even more. Next slide. And of course, the men then reacted, and this news story came out, and it said a group of advertising executives claim they lost their jobs because they are white, male, straight, and British, after a director announced plans to obliterate the Mad Men culture. And it was because Jo Wallace, who was a creative director of the J. Walter Thompson advertising agency, and she had said that she wanted to promote more females. And then, of course, that got men in advertising and the Mad Men culture upset. So as we've just seen, there is a lot of misogyny in the actual industry. Next slide. So is advertising ageist? So I want to explore now another issue of issue that we have in advertising. So next slide. And the definition of ageism, this comes from an article by Olson and Scott, and they define ageism as a systemic stereotyping and discrimination against older people. Next slide. And Creative Review published this article just last week with the headline, "Is advertising finally addressing its age problem?" Advertising has long been obsessed with youth, but in the industry, is the industry finally waking up to the opportunities that older generation present, both in campaign and behind the scenes? And advertising's age-old problem has been well documented over the years. If you're over 50, you probably noticed the conspicuous absence of people who look like you in advertising. Next slide. The article then goes on to say that the makeup of the industry certainly doesn't help either, with the latest IPA census revealing that the average age of employees in creative agencies is just 36. There seems to be an age gap where it all gets a bit Logan's Run, and you're deemed to be spent, says Jules Chalkley, Chief Executive Creative Officer at Ogilvy UK. We have to have fresh talent coming in that is adept at media platforms that are being created all the time. But equally, we shouldn't be too quick to let go of the more experienced talent. The craft capability that is locked up in these individuals, the experience, the knowledge, it's a real shame that we lose it. Next slide. And then there's a great blog that is in the States, I think it's in Advertising Age and online. And the Ad Contrarian says, the idea that young people dominate agencies because of economics is not ageism, is total bullshit. Most agencies wouldn't hire a 50-year-old copywriter if she became free and gift wrapped. So there's the conversation about ageism in advertising. But of course, you guys are young, so it does definitely benefit you. Next slide, please. So let's look at how brands are trying to be more inclusive and diverse. Next slide. There's a term that is happening right now and is becoming popular, is #brownwashing. And it is defined in the Urban Dictionary, because it's such a new term, as conspicuous overrepresentation disproportionate to the population of racial minorities in advertising. So a way to sort of set that up is, who is this retailer trying to target this advertisement full of brown washing? You get the impression that ethnic minorities make up 50% of the population by watching it, when in actual fact, there are only 2% of the population in this area. Next slide. And in Britain, we had the very famous last Christmas Sainsbury's ad, the gravy ad, which was fantastic. And next slide. And that caused a lot of controversy on social media, with people supporting Sainsbury's and other people declaring that they weren't going to shop at Sainsbury's again. And it is an example of how different brands are now reacting to what happened with the George Floyd murder that happened in America early 2020. And there was that big debate, and Black Lives Matter became synonymous with racial equality all around the world. And brands jumped on the bandwagon. And what it seems now is that many brands are trying to include people of color in their advertising, which is great. But that has sort of created this term or concept of brown washing, where brands are trying to appear to be people of color friendly. Next slide. And of course, we have the hashtag whitewashing. So what is whitewashing? Well, it's a deliberate attempt to conceal unpleasant or incriminating facts about someone or something. Next slide. So if you apply that concept to advertising, you will look at brands. Some of these are sold in the UK and Europe. Most of them are from North America, but there's Aunt Jemima, we have Mrs. Butterworth's maple syrup, we have Uncle Ben's rice, and Land O'Lakes butter. And all those brands last year redesigned their packaging and basically eliminated any reference to ethnicity. Next slide. So in the case of Aunt Jemima, what they did is whitewashed Aunt Jemima, took away her name, her face, her history, and turned the brand into the Pearl Milling Company. Next slide. And of course, this meme came out after Land O'Lakes took away the indigenous person and called the product Land O'Lakes. And I think this meme is great because it says, well, how American, they got rid of the Indian and kept the land. Next slide. So whitewashing is a good thing in terms of reacting to social injustices. However, we need to look at the consequences of that and what does it mean? Yes, maybe it's wrong to be showing, and a lot of people said that it was wrong to be glorifying and selling a brand that reflected the history of the mammy or the nana in American culture and the female black slave or maid. However, the consequences is that the brand is trying to make itself change the way it's looked. So now let's look at what Nike did right after the George Floyd protests. I think it's okay that there's no audio here because at least it's all supers. Great. So that was Nike, and Nike has a history of supporting Black athletes in America. Next slide. But one thing I wrote an article about this, and one thing that I concluded is that companies paying for advertising need to change by practicing what they preach. And this means that they need to follow through and act on their recent messages of solidarity. Even though Nike has supported Black athletes over the years, the company has been questioned over its lack of Black representation on its leadership team. So brands associating themselves with racial equality need to back words with actions. And so, you know, one problem that we have in advertising is the fact that we follow trends, we look at what's happening, and then we try to create messaging that reflects popular thinking. But we need also to think about brand values. And, you know, if we're preaching and saying something, then we better well be doing it within our advertising agency. Next slide. Now, today, an article came out in Campaign. And what's great about the article is that it looks at the ethnic makeup within advertising agencies. Next slide. And the article is called, "How is it still a white Christmas?" When questioned on this representation gap, our defense as an industry tends to be point or tends to point to improvement in on-screen inclusion. The problem with this is that at worst, we're solving racial diversity issues in casting and passing it off as inclusion, when at best, we're making our own interpretation of how a minority might feel. Next slide. So this article is about the fact that many brands are featuring people of color in their Christmas advertising. But what this article does is look at who are the people actually creating those messages. And what they found of 20, I think it's 28 commercials that they analyzed that are on air right now in the UK. And they looked at the creative people, and they found that 91% of the creative people of those ads that feature people of color, they're 91% white. And if you see that part of the pie with orange and gray and gold, you will see that those are people who are Black, Asian, and minority ethnic. And so again, it's like what I said in that Nike article, you have to practice what you preach. And if advertising is going to be reflecting society and promoting inclusion and diversity in our messages, we need to do it within the industry. Next slide. So even though UK Christmas advertising is showing people of color, the people that create them are overwhelmingly white, and we need to start changing that attitude within our industry. Next slide. So let's look at solutions that are happening. Next slide. But we do have the ASA, which is the Advertising Standards Authority. Next slide. And they are paid for by the advertising agencies, but they're an independent body. In America, they have their system. Mexico has different systems. In India, I believe they have their version of the ASA. And what the ASA did in Britain, they did a study of gender stereotypes. Next slide. And they created rules about how to represent gender. And I think it was a year and a half ago, they banned 2 ads for representing gender's stereotypes in a negative way. And this is a picture from a Philadelphia cream ad. Next slide. And also what we do in advertising is that we do messaging. We do a lot of pro bono ads. We do, I know when I worked at different agencies, we did advertising for UNICEF, for United Nations, for different charities in Mexico, for the Salvation Army in Canada. And we always look for ways of creating these messaging, and we donated our time to do it. And here are some examples of advertising that's being done against violence against children and females. So that is a positive thing, next slide, that we do within the industry. And also there are agencies. There's a great one here in London called Quiet Storm. And what they did is that they created their own campaign that was done actually through workshops, I believe, with youths that lived in Brixton and areas like that. And they created these wonderful posters that were placed up around to support the concept of anti-racism. Next slide. Then there are blogs and there are many advice columns. And this is a great one where this talks about how the creative industries, how women needs to take power and take control. And what she says here is, how do we make changes in the creative industry that will encourage women to dive in feet first and make their career dreams come true? Women in the industry have to be louder, and we need to make ourselves known to other women starting out. And I think that's a really great piece of advice. Next slide. There also is this article here where we have another person who is speaking specifically to creative grads. And she makes recommendations on how to fix this industry that many graduates are going into. And she urges females to find mentors. And she says, my mentor has been an invaluable guide and sounding board throughout my career. And of course, their gender isn't important. My mentor is a man, and he's a great supporter of feminine workers in the industry. Next slide. So there are solutions also through blogs. And then there is a really great magazine online called Adbusters. Adbusters is based in Canada, but they have different versions in different languages around the world. And they make critiques of capitalism and advertising. Next slide. And what they do is a thing called subvertisements. And what a subvertisement is a well-produced subvert mimics the look and feel of the targeted ad, promoting the classic double take, as we will suddenly realize they have been duped. Next slide. So this is an example, Reality for Men, for making fun of Obsession for Men, which is from Calvin Klein at Cologne. Next slide. And then here we have an ad that is commenting on how we buy brands to create our identity. So subvertisements are a great way, next slide, to criticize capitalism. And there's even more solutions in next slide. So here in Britain, we have the Advertising Association, and their main focus right now is rebuilding public trust in UK advertising. Next slide. So what they have on their website is an all-in hub that features different organizations in the UK that will help advertising agencies deal with diversity and inclusion. Next slide. And so they feature in their hub this group called Black BRIM, which is Black Representation in Marketing, and they give BRIM framework tools that advertising agencies can use. Next slide. There is also the Conscious Advertising Network, which is 70 brands in the UK that have got together, and they're looking for ways to ensure that the advertising industry ethics catches up with the technology of modern advertising. Next slide. There is also the ISBA, which is championing an advertising environment that is transparent, responsible, and accountable. Next slide. And they give best practice examples so that advertising agencies know what they need to do. There is also this organization called CODE, which I believe is based in the University of Manchester, if I'm not wrong. And they are the center on the dynamics of ethnicity. And they held a conference a few weeks ago, and they do different videos academically that criticizes and observes advertising and helps sort of investigate ethnic, racial, and religious inequalities in the culture industries. Next slide. Creative Access is also to help the creative industries reflect our society. And they just did a really great talk on on-screen and off-screen diversity and why it matters. Next slide. And of course, agencies are looking and questioning themselves on what they do. And here is a design company, RGA, that has written this article and has published it on Medium, where they look at their own racial breakdown and gender breakdown in their company to challenge themselves and to make sure that they are respecting the rules that they have set for themselves and are reaching their goals and objectives. Next slide. So, but please keep in mind, next slide. So it's great that, you know, the industry is doing all these things, but the thing about diversity initiatives is that no one solved it yet. So when the industry speaks to diversity or people who are ethnically diverse in creativity, only 35% said that diversity initiatives benefited their career. And here's a quote that I put here. This 30-year-old Asian Pakistani said, "Because then I don't want to be hired as diversity. I want to be hired as, well, because I'm competent. I want the obstacles to go away, but I don't want to become an icon of any kind," which goes back to what I said earlier from the actress from Grey's Anatomy, where she said, normalize. Let's normalize everything. Why do we have to be focusing on it? It should just be normal that we have people of color and we have women and we have older people working in the industry all together. Next slide. And also intersectionality. So just by having more diversity in advertising public relation industries is a great starting point. However, we have a long way to go. Next slide. And there's a really interesting article that just got published recently by Olson and Scott, and they say that acknowledging that the overlap of various social identities, such as a person's age, race, or gender, sexuality, and class, may contribute to the specific type of systemic oppression and discrimination experienced by an individual. Next slide. So this is a quote they had within the article. So it's very important to think about intersectionality, where we have maybe a female who is older and she's of color. How is that dealt with within the industry? So it's not just looking at all the categories separately. We need to also see how they intersect and work together. Now, of course, you guys are students and you're looking for a job. And a lot of you look at the ranking of agencies and diversity. It seems to be the trend now. You know, how do agencies do on hiring women? How do agencies do on now hiring people of color? And they're trends. And one thing that we think you should think about is research agencies yourselves. Speak to people who work there. And also look at the actual values of the agency and do they reflect your values? Remember that advertising is very focused on trending topics. We seem to do that a lot. And so a lot of advertising agencies try to follow these trending topics. And so just be aware of these charts and that reflect diversity and say this agency here is the most hires the most diverse workforce. Just question that and do some research before you start looking at an agency that's top of the charts. Okay, so next slide, and I think we're getting close to the end of the talk. So in conclusion, next slide. What we've done is we've looked and asked, why does diversity matter? We've also questioned, does advertising influence or reflect society? Then we looked at specific diverse and different issues such as misogyny, ageism, and we looked at gender. And we also questioned, does the culture industry and why do they use stereotypes to represent race and gender? Then we focused on a case study of brownwashing versus whitewashing. And then we looked at some solutions such as the Advertising Standards Authority, Quiet Storm, the agency, and also taking control of the industry. And also it's very important to keep in mind intersectionality. So next slide. Thank you very much for listening to this talk on the importance of diversity and inclusion in the advertising industry. Next slide. And these are ways of reaching me, which is also on the page of Eventbrite. I'm also on LinkedIn, and follow me on Twitter because I also tweet all about these types of things that we talked about today. Next slide. And does anybody have any questions? So Danny, if we can open it up, please, and then we can have a conversation. I know that I put up this question, should advertising ban the use of stereotypes? And I don't know whether anybody wrote any answers in the chat.
My screen has decided to be really slow, so I'm just getting to the chat. Oh, now, 1 second. Oh, goodness. My mouse has been vanishing and reappearing the whole time. I've been having a little...
Do you think we should continue sharing the screen? Would that help?
It might help if I did stop sharing screen.
Yeah.
Yes, if you give me a second. Of course, it doesn't want to cooperate with me now because Sod's Law is the finest thing there is. I'll pause sharing. Okay,
Yeah.
so just to clarify, can everyone see me at the moment?
Yes. Oh, good. So there's quite a few things in the chat.
Yes, I cannot seem to escape my screen, so that's just wonderful.
So Tom S said, I mean, I can
No,
continue
go
while
for
you're
it.
typing.
You go for it.
Together.
I'm just
So
getting.
Tom S said, maybe stereotypes should not be completely banned, but monitored. Stereotypes will be needed to tell stories quickly as part of the advert. So that's very interesting, Tom. Do you have a microphone there that you want to just build upon what you just said? Because I think, well, one thing I think is interesting about stereotypes is that there's positive stereotypes and there's negative stereotypes. And, you know, the positive stereotype could be like a Scotsman in the kilt, right? Scotland benefits and Scotland created that stereotype and uses it. It's sold in all their tourist spots. However, negative stereotypes could be, say, in Mexico, where they always show maids as indigenous people. So that would be an example of a negative stereotype. So I definitely think it's interesting what you say. And you're right. Your observation that we use stereotypes in advertising to quickly tell the story. So I think maybe as creative people, we need to question when we have a stereotype, is this a positive stereotype or a negative one? Leticia underneath said advertising should consider diversity just because diversity is segmented into different types of subjects, such as political advertising uses diversity to try and get voters or citizens to vote. This means that diverse audiences are treated like consumers because the campaign has used diversity to position audiences to think and act a certain way. In this case, political advertising is an example. So Leticia, yeah, that's great. Do you want to build upon what you just said?
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm a student of Carl, and I wanted to build up on that because I think voters also have a voice. They're kind of segmented into psychographic, I'm sure you know, psychographic, demographic, behavioralistic, but also how they segmentate it manipulates the way that we act towards students, towards how we think, especially like as a student. For me, for example, let's say in America, I can't vote because I'm not 21. I'm 19. So there's that age difference. But with diversity, I think we shouldn't erase it. I think there's definitely like white lines between it. But I think because it's such a huge subject, it's very hard to understand what diversity is. I think each person has a say in what diversity is. And I definitely agree with you, Carl, about negative and positive stereotypes. But I think now, more going into, I think it's diversity is like a simulacra where it's like losing its detached meaning of what it is. So I think that's a huge part of why advertisers use it today in around the world. For example, in Brazil, advertising around billboards is not allowed because it's a way of pollution. So that's how they've used it. That's how they've segmented their demographic, psychographic. They've used STP to try and segmentate audiences to not feel in a different way when they're seeing a billboard image in a different country, if they're Brazilian, for example.
Great. Thank you very much, Leticia. Good observations there. And just saying how politics uses stereotypes as well, because we've seen how the left wing and the right wing use stereotypes to get across their messaging. So thank you very much for bringing that up. Somebody said, Dan Wrong says, if it's not harmful, then yes, because advertising needs to drive emotions, and those semiotics are important. Advertising should follow KISS, which tend to use a bit of good and light stereotypes too. So Dan Wrong, are you there? Can you just expand on what you're trying to say there?
Yes, I think it sort of reflected to what you just mentioned about the good stereotypes. So I think the positive stereotypes should still be used in advertising, because advertising should be should be to drive emotion so that it can be effective, and that's why the clients are paying money to the agency people. So I think ultimately a light use of positive stereotypes should be allowed. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for those observations. So you're happy with stereotypes. We just need to think about good versus negative, positive versus negative. Thank you. Megan. Megan says, I think it would be ideal if stereotypes could be banned from advertising altogether, but that wouldn't make them go away. Also, I feel like most advertising, just by definition, has stereotypes to appeal to the audience. Racist and misogynic stereotypes should be what is banned. Okay, so Megan, do you want to build upon what you just said? If not, no worries. I think what you're saying is, at the beginning, you're saying that all stereotypes should be banned, but then I feel at the end of what you're saying, I think you're agreeing with sort of what the consensus seems to be about negative stereotypes. And you get more focused with what you're saying. So it's not all stereotypes. It seems to be racist and misogynistic stereotypes is what you think should be banned. So that is good. And so a question I would have is just how would we do that in advertising? There's the ASA, but the thing about the ASA is that they wait for the public to complain. The ASA doesn't just ban ads. People phone up, they complain, and then when they have complaints, then the ASA discusses and then makes a conclusion. So I guess maybe, Megan, do you think that maybe we need to have other rules, maybe advertising agencies themselves, when they're doing the piece of creative or writing the strategy, need to ask themselves those questions? Christine says, I've written an assignment on stereotypes in advertising once, and one way of answering your questions should be that we have to move on with the times. A lot of the roles have changed over time, and brands need to stay relevant and resonate with their audience. Stereotypes may suggest that the brand hasn't evolved or learned from the past, and certain stereotypical aspects are often not flattering. If used, it should be addressed, the issues of society of today as well. Sorry, one way of answering could be my bad. No worries, Christine. So do you want to just build upon what you just said there? Nope, that's fine. Totally understand what you're saying. It's great that you've written about this subject, because stereotypes is a very interesting subject, and a lot of the roles have changed. You're right. So the stereotypes as we saw from 100 years ago are very offensive now for some, like the soap ads. And imagine when the world looks at the advertising that we're doing now that we think is great, and that everybody's like, oh yes, that's diverse, but people will be looking at it, and then maybe they will have issues with those ads with things that we aren't even aware of now. How's everything going, Danny? Have you been able to? You're not turned on your microphone. No worries.
It's been a long day, apologies. But
No
yes,
worries.
no, that's fine. I actually do have 2 more questions that have come in to be asked. So I think we'll just answer them and end there, really. So the question number 1 was, do you think students and graduates who freshly joined the industry can contribute to more diversity and inclusion in advertising? And if so, how can they achieve this?
Great. Can you just say the beginning of the question, Danny?
So it says, do you think students and graduates who freshly joined industry can contribute to diversity and inclusion in advertising?
Yes, of course. Well, one is conversations like we're just having now. I think, these things were not discussed. I remember when I was studying school, I was just taught how to create an ad, how to art direct, how to pick typefaces, how to answer a brief, and we never had discussions about the consequences of advertising. And I think what's very excellent right now about your generation is that you guys are aware of how to create messaging, and also you're aware of the consequences. And so when you go for job interviews and when you go and work in agencies in your internships and start your jobs, speak up. and let people know what you think. And when you're in meetings and you're reviewing creative as an account person or strategic person, or when you're a creative person and you're brainstorming with the other creatives and these types of things come up like stereotypes, say what you think. And you guys are the new generation, you're getting in, and as what has been said before in these questions and statements, advertising is changing and we're growing, and you know, and you guys are the future. So just speak up is my advice.
Sure.
And conversations like this, and also in the job.
No, I totally agree, and thank you for answering that. And then the other question that was posed was, if a brand accidentally messes up, such as with the Dove ad that you showed, for example, what would the brand have to do for damage control? Or is there nothing a brand can do once they've once they get cancelled based on diversity issues?
So I think the Dove ad you're referring to is the one that was on Facebook, was it? And it was where there were different women using soap and using the Dove soap and then taking off their tops and then revealing another woman underneath. And one ad that was, what happened is that there was a woman of color who then took off her top and then became white. And so what was interesting is that that ad offended many people because it was very similar to those early ads I showed you from Victorian times from Britain that focused on skin color and cleanliness. Yeah. So I just wanted to clarify that, but can you just ask the end of that question so I could, because my memory sucks.
No, that's okay. Give me a second. Let me pull it back up. So once that's happened, essentially, what would the brand have to do for damage control, or is there nothing a brand can do once they get cancelled based on diversity issues?
We're seeing these diversity issues a lot with fashion brands, for example, with brands that are doing, whether on clothing and things like that. And what brands do is they have PR companies, and those PR companies usually come up with a position. But I think what a brand needs to do is open up and say, yes, we're sorry, we didn't realize, and we need to move on, and we will correct that, take down the offending ad, and we won't repeat that mistake again. But of course, I come from advertising, and my opinion is that those ads should never see the light of day. And I just don't understand why they don't use things like semiotics, or they don't do research so that they can understand how the public is going to react to the ad before it's broadcast. So I think as an industry, we just need to not just get ads out as quick as they can so we can get them on social media. We need to do a little thinking and just see how people may look at that ad and how it could be construed. And, you know, and again, as I showed you with the makeup of people who are creating messages in advertising, they're like 91% white. We need to hire people who are diverse, different genders, different ages, different abilities, so that those people in the agency can look at the ad and say, hey, I'm an old Black female, and that image is offensive to me. You know, and if you have a bunch of white people doing the ad, they may not think of other people and other ethnicities looking at the ad and how they may feel about it.
Thank you very much for that answer, also very insightful. So just I think that'll close up the questions, and we've basically nearly just hit 6, so just a few little bits from me and then we'll end. So to everyone listening today, thank you very much for listening. To start your networking off, Carl mentioned earlier that he is happy to be reached through LinkedIn, Twitter, and that was in his slides, and I believe he'll be sharing a PDF with us later that we can then share with anybody that would be interested in it. I'd just like to say a massive thank you to Carl for delivering such a thought-provoking talk today, and to our wonderful audience for being here today. Again, if you'd like to find out more hints and tips on becoming a professional in advertising, you can check out our website at hatcollective.co.uk with our weekly blogs and industry blogs, or just check out our social media platforms for more great content. And that's it, folks. Thank you for coming. I'm going to stop recording now.